Okay, so let's discuss the different research methods, and I'm going to start with the descriptive methods. So there we go. Okay, so let's start with case study. Why is this not going? There we go. Okay. The definition of a case study is that we're going to study one participant in really great depth so we can really understand that individual, their past, their present, maybe their goals for the future. We might give them specific tests like memory tests or personality tests. We might interview their friends and family to get to know them even better from different angles, how do other people see them, things like that. The goal of a case study is really to reveal underlying behavioral principles. Our goal is not to say, well, Susie acts like this, therefore all humans act like this, or all women act like this. Instead, the goal is just to sort of get an idea about how an individual behaves, and if we study enough different individuals, maybe we'll start to get a pattern and start to understand. So I've got some examples of case studies that have been done in the past. There was a man who did a study of prostitutes in Baltimore with the goal of trying to figure out, what factors in a woman's past might lead to them choosing to become prostitutes. He studied like 5 individual prostitutes, and then across the 5 of them looked for consistencies in their stories. His data is not enough for us to really understand prostitutes on its own, but he was able to, with a very small sample, get some themes, some consistencies that led other people to ask questions and to formulate hypotheses that then they tried to test out with a different sample and things like that. So a lot of times case studies are sort of the starting point, and then other researchers take it farther. How do nails in the head affect behavior? I really liked this x-ray of this poor person who must have shown up at the ER with nails in their head. I guess they must have been at a construction site or something. You better believe that when you have damage to some part of your brain, psychologists would like to study you, or psychiatrists might want to study you to see what effect that damage has had. My husband's best friend in high school, he was our best man at our wedding, a couple years later got into a really bad car accident without his seatbelt on, and he hit his head on the steering wheel and was really, really damaged. And he was having seizures and difficulty with his memory and things like that. Well, he was in Southern California, and UCLA included him in a study of people who had had blows to their frontal lobe on the left side, which is exactly what he'd had. And they gave him all sorts of memory tests. They gave him personality tests. They interviewed his parents and his siblings and my husband and different people who knew him to ask about things that they might have noticed have changed since the accident. They asked him to do psychomotor tasks to look for changes in his ability to control his hands and feet and face and, things like that. The point being that you really can't study these questions any other way except for through a case study, because we are not allowed to recruit people to an experiment where we're going to hit you in the frontal lobe and see what effect it has on you for the rest of your life, right? I'm really pleased to report we're not allowed to do that. So you have to take people as they come. So people who have had the damage that's enough that it's causing behavioral effects, but not so much that they died, right? That's sort of the sweet spot for case studies. And then you study them in really great detail to get ideas about what role different brain areas play in different kinds of behaviors. Pretty much everything we know about multiple personality disorder has come from case studies, where an individual presents him or herself to their psychiatrist. The psychiatrist realizes that the person has multiple personality disorder, and then they start trying to look into their past and into their current behaviors and all sorts of things to try and figure out what is associated with this disorder. A more purposeful type of study where you don't just sort of take people as they come would be studies of the effect of dreams on memory storage, stuff like that, any kind of sleep study. sleeping is such a universal behavior that one healthy individual can really represent all people. And so when you have a really expensive design where you have to have people sleeping at your sleep lab and you're feeding them and taking care of them for weeks on end, it kind of makes sense to just do the study with as few people as you really need in order to answer the question. So a lot of our sleep studies are based on one or a few people. Now, just to repeat, these case studies would never be the end of the story. These are really the starting points of psychological inquiry. So you sort of see how one person reacted or a couple people reacted, and then that causes you to ask questions that would motivate you to find out, well, what if we found 10 people who had all gotten nails in their head? Let's look and see how that, how their behaviors changed, and like that. So you expand out from the case study. Oh, and the other thing about case studies is not only would you collect, maybe try and get a sample of people together in one study. Another thing that's done with case studies, and this is particularly true for the multiple personality disorder research, individuals who were identified by their psychiatrists were described in academic journal articles. And then in the 1970s, a researcher took all the existing reports on people with MPD and analyzed all the data as though it were one big study. And that's when it became really clear that every person in the study, the one thing they had in common was that they had been significantly abused in their really early childhood. So now we take it pretty much for granted that a person who has multiple personality disorder was probably physically or sexually abused when they were really little. Now, don't go the other direction and think of a person who might have been sexually abused and therefore let's look for multiple personality disorder, because that's not the coping mechanism that everybody displays. It seems to be there's more to it to determine whether you would invoke that strategy for coping. Okay, the next kind of description that I wanted to talk about is the bread and butter of psychology, which is the survey. We love a good survey. You can thank the functionalists for that. They came up with strategies for asking questions so that we don't have to wait to observe the behavior ourselves. So it's really efficient to do surveys. The idea with the surveys, we're going to use some strategy. It could be in writing, it could be oral questions, it could be on the internet. We're going to use some kind of strategy to elicit your self-report of your attitudes, your opinions, your behaviors. So as you can see this person doing, I value freedom and independence, and then they're rating how much they agree with that on a scale from 1 to 5, right? So that's the idea in a survey. And like I said, it can be oral or written or on the internet. It's all still a survey. Okay, so I wanted to describe some of the problems that are inherent in surveys. A lot of them have to do with wording effects. So I'm going to stick with wording effects and give you lots of examples of what I mean by wording effects. Here's an example of a question that was posed to a group of respondents. Do you favor an amendment prohibiting abortions? A different group of people were asked, do you favor protecting the life of the unborn child? Now, the survey takers try to argue that these are really basically equivalent questions. I think we could all agree that these are not really equivalent questions. An amendment prohibiting abortions is different from protecting the life of an unborn child in that you have some vagueness in the second one, so that maybe you could interpret that to mean providing prenatal care or education about the value of wearing a seatbelt while you're pregnant, or a whole bunch of things, including abortion, but that's not necessarily the first thing that the respondents might have been thinking of. So they're worded differently, even though the survey taker, the two different survey groups who administered these questions, the second guy in particular said, it's the same question, what are you talking about? What's important about this is that 20% more respondents agreed with, do you favor protecting the life of an unborn child, than agreed with, do you favor an amendment prohibiting abortions? So I think we can all agree they aren't really asking the same question. That's one wording effect. But another wording effect might be more subtle and you might not have noticed it. In the first question, it has the word prohibiting. Research has shown that Americans don't like to agree to any question that involves the words prohibit, deny, limit, anything that makes it sound like you don't have the right to choose your behavior, whatever the question is. So that's what we call an inflammatory word, the word prohibit. So by including prohibiting, it right off reduced the number of people who would agree with that statement. So even if we don't keep reading to the word abortion, as soon as they saw prohibit, a lot of people just go, I'm already not liking this question. And we're more likely to say, no, I don't agree with this. Okay, staying on the topic of wording effects. Sometimes we design surveys to have complex terms that we don't realize as the survey maker that the survey taker may not understand. It's particularly a problem, where you've got PhDs in psychology writing a series of questions and they know all the words. I know sometimes I run into this with my test questions. I assume everybody knows what the word ambiguous means, and not everybody does. And so when designing a test or when designing a survey, it's really important to make sure that you use terms that are at the reading level of the anticipated survey taker. Most researchers shoot for about an 8th grade reading level, which can be kind of insulting to a college student. There's a survey that I use in my human sexuality class that's asking about people's knowledge of sexual things, and it's funny because they use normal scientific terms in the question, and then in parentheses they'll use like normal slang terms, and it's kind of insulting to students who are taking a human sexuality class. They know what these words mean, and then why are you putting, they've got the word testicles in the question, and then in parentheses it'll say balls, and it's like, what is that? But the reason why they put it there is because some people may not know what the word testicle means. And so the survey maker realized that, and they made sure to write it at the correct level. Now, what do survey takers do when they encounter a question that they really don't understand because they don't understand the terms? Well, only way to know that is to do a study on it. So some surveyors stood outside the New York Museum of Natural History with a little table, and as people came out of the museum, they invited them to come over and fill out a questionnaire about the museum. So it all looked like it was really just about the museum, but when in fact they were studying the effect of complex terms. On the survey, there were these questions all mixed up and amongst other questions. So you didn't see botany and paleontology and trees and plants and fossils all in a row like this. They're all mixed up. And they were asked, how interested are you in botany? How interested are you in paleontology? And so on. 39% of respondents reported being interested in botany and paleontology, even though they just walked out of the Museum of Natural History, which kind of implies they must be interested in paleontology, right? There's all these Tyrannosaurus rex skeletons and things like that, and botany, there's all these plant specimens and things in there. But only 39% of people reported being interested in the stuff that was in the museum that they just came out of. But 77% of people said they were interested in plants and trees, and 48% said they were interested in fossils. So there are a couple of interpretations. One is that most people didn't understand the words botany and paleontology, so they said, I must not like it, or I'd know what it was, right? So they just said, no, I'm not interested in those things. And that's the interpretation most of us take, that, the terms were too complex, and so people said no. Of course, the other interpretation is they know full well what those words mean, and they don't they know that botany means the study of plants. And they're like, I don't want to go to school and study plants. I like going in the museum and looking at them, but no, I don't want to study it. So it might be that they knew what it meant, and they literally meant, yeah, I like plants and trees, but not botany. But what we're worried about as survey makers is the possibility that people, when confronted with words they don't know, disagree with those words. They basically in their minds think, I don't know what that is, so I'll say no. And so it's really important when making a survey, and psychologists are acutely aware of this, when you're making a survey to use words that you know that your survey takers will understand. Okay, still on the topic of wording effects. Here's another example. This was an actual question that was posed in I think it was a 2002 Gallup poll. Would you favor an amendment to the Constitution that would allow marriage only between a man and a woman? Versus, I think this one was a Roper poll question. Should the U.S. Constitution be amended to ban gay marriage, or is it enough to prohibit gay marriage by law without changing the Constitution? All right, I think you can probably see the wording problem in the second question. It's too long for one thing. These polls were delivered on the phone, and so the second one's too long for a person on the phone to hold all that information in their head. Second off, it contradicts itself. Halfway through, it goes, or is it enough? And so what's the correct response? Yes or no? Can I say yes to half and no to the other half? What if I don't like any of it? It kind of is set up so that you have to agree with either amend the Constitution or ban by law. It doesn't give you sort of a no, I don't like either one of those. So what you end up with is a lot more support for the first phrasing than the second. So I'm focusing on the complexity of the second question. Let's also focus on the word ban and prohibit that are encompassed in that second question. So like I said earlier, people tend to say no to stuff that it includes ban and prohibit, whereas see the first question says, should it be amended so that it would allow, right? People are more willing to agree to allow than they are to ban or prohibit. So the way that the first one was phrased was much more likely to elicit support than the way that the second one was. For one thing, because of the complexity of the question and the fact that it was contradicting itself, and then also because it contained ban and prohibit. All right, this is fun, right? There are a lot of things that go wrong. Okay, this is another example where if you open the PowerPoints themselves and watch this like a slideshow, you'll be able to click on this video and watch this example of a naturalistic observation. In a naturalistic observation, we're going to observe and record the behavior of whatever our subjects are. They may be animals, they may be humans, they may be children, they may be families, they may, right? It could be lots of different subjects. And the key thing is you're going to do it in the natural setting. Naturalistic means, by definition, you go to where they normally exist and you watch them in their natural habitat. The example I've got for you is not truly natural in the sense that they're aware that they're being videotaped. In fact, they might be doing it for the purposes of the video. But the purpose of this example that I do in my in-person class is we watch the video and the student's job is to look for objective behaviors. Like only note those things that any one of us would be able to verify with our own eyes. So you don't want to write down any inferences that you draw about the behavior that you're observing. You only want to write down what you literally saw. And if you want to pause me and go watch this on the internet, you can also just Google it on YouTube. It's called Balinese Baraka Monkey Chant. So if you want to pause me. Okay, so now we're back. The purpose of the exercise is to notice how hard it is not to draw inferences while you're doing an observation. I've given you this example that probably most of you have never seen this particular set of behaviors before, and so hopefully you'd be coming into it blind, not like anybody who's doing a naturalistic observation. And it's really hard not to sit there while you're making the observation and wonder, why are they doing this? What does this mean? Oh, it looks to me like this is happening or that's happening, and it must be because of. And it's really hard not to leap to those causal conclusions or draw other kinds of inferences. In a naturalistic observation, you are solely there to describe the behavior. And so it's really important for an observer to stick to observing and not to drawing any inferences. Now, what happens when we do descriptive studies is that we oftentimes discover a correlation between two of the variables. Two of the things that we're observing, we start to notice seem to go together. A correlation is an observation that two traits or attributes seem to be related to each other. That we tend to see them together. Like I mentioned, that the researcher had done case studies on prostitutes, and one of the things that he noticed was a correlation between the age of first sexual intercourse and then the probability of becoming a prostitute. So he noticed that these things went together, that girls who, particularly those who were very young and who had, by very young I meant early teens, and there was another variable that was important, and was whether that first sexual intercourse was voluntary or not. Those things went together with the probability of becoming a prostitute. That's a correlation that was discovered as he analyzed his purely descriptive information. So my little slides are not going forward for some reason. This is not good. This is no good. Okay, so in a case study, the fewer hours the boy was able to sleep, the more episodes of aggression he displayed. That would be the observer noticing that these two things seem to go together. Sleep deprivation was associated with aggression the next day. So correlations are when you notice that two things are going together. In a naturalistic observation, children in a classroom who were dressed in heavier clothes were more likely to fall asleep than those wearing lighter clothes. So we're noticing that what you wear is associated with the probability of you falling asleep during class. In a survey, the greater number of Facebook friends, the less time spent studying, right? We ask you how many Facebook friends you have and how much time you spend studying, and we see that those two things seem to go together. These are examples of discovering associations between variables that were collected in a descriptive way. Okay, so what's a correlation? Well, a correlation is a statistical measure of the relationship between two variables. So it's not a way of collecting data, it's a way of analyzing data. It's a statistic, and believe me, I'm not going to show you the formula or make you calculate it. We have a way of taking each score for an individual into account, putting them together, dividing and subtracting, taking some square roots, a bunch of stuff goes on, and yada yada. We figure out that sometimes high scores on one variable are associated with high scores on the other. Sometimes high scores on one variable are associated with low scores on the other. But those variables are somehow related with each other. The thing that's really tough is for us to remember that just because two variables are related to each other does not mean that one of them is causing the other one. So just because the child who was deprived of sleep behaved more aggressively the next day, that does not mean that we can say now that sleep deprivation causes aggression. We can't say that based on a correlation. All we can say is that the two variables go together. So why? Why can't we go further? Well, for one thing, when two variables are correlated, sorry, I'm trying to decide how to phrase this. Two variables are correlated, and let's say one is causing the other. We have no way of knowing which way the cause flows. Let me show you pictorially. This might make more sense. We call this the directionality problem. Psychologists have known for a really long time that there's a correlation between self-esteem and depression. Typically, lower self-esteem is associated with higher rates of depression. Okay. It's possible that your level of self-esteem causes your level of depression. So having higher self-esteem will protect you from depression, and that lower self-esteem might cause depression. It's possible. But it's just as possible that your level of depression can cause your level of self-esteem, so that people who are more depressed, that their depression causes them to have lower self-esteem, or people who aren't depressed, that causes them to have higher self-esteem. With a correlation, there's no way to figure it out, which way the cause flows. All we know is that the two go together. So we call this the directionality problem. If one's causing the other, we have no idea which way it flows. Another problem is called the third variable problem. So let's stick with our depression and self-esteem example. And the third variable problem tells us maybe depression and self-esteem aren't causing each other at all. Maybe it's not a directionality issue. Maybe it's that there's a third variable, like biological predisposition, that's causing both your level of depression and your level of self-esteem. Or maybe there's some kind of family factor that's causing depression and self-esteem. So, a good supportive family might cause you to have lower levels of depression and higher levels of self-esteem, and a more dysfunctional climate might cause higher levels of depression, lower levels of self-esteem. The key thing being here, depression and self-esteem aren't causing each other. They're both being caused by some third variable. That's the problem with a correlation. We never know what's causing what. We just know that two variables are going together. I really, probably most of you are not psych majors, and you're taking this class among a lot of choices that you had for your social science, breadth requirement. So I always like to think, what do I want you to take away from a class like this? One of the things I'd like you to take away is a way of thinking critically about information that you will encounter throughout life, from magazines and the newspaper, and who reads a newspaper? I meant to say the internet, and or the newscast if you watch those. They oftentimes report correlations, but they report them in such a way that your mind naturally wants to think about them as causally linked. So let's give an example, and let's see if I can show you how not to succumb to seeing correlations that don't really exist. Okay, an illusory correlation. I did spell that word correctly. It's illusory. Illusory means that it's in your perception. It's not really existing. So you're seeing two variables going together that really don't go together. Okay, now in my in-person classes, I always like to ask my class, do any of you know a couple who adopted a child because they couldn't conceive their own child, or because they hadn't been able to carry one to term? And usually people will raise their hand. I always raise my hand because that's what happened with my grandparents. They had a number of miscarriages, and then they ultimately adopted my mom. So I always raise my hand. And then I ask, of those of you who know a couple who's adopted, because they thought they couldn't have children, how many of them ended up having their own biological children after the adoption? And I always keep my hand up because my mom was my grandparents' first child, and then 4 years later they had a biological child. So that's an example where you see a couple that adopted and then went on to have their own child. Now, when I was little, I didn't know any better, so I asked my grandma, if you guys could have kids, why'd you adopt my mom? And my grandma explained that, before they got my mom, they were so tense about having children and stuff like that. There was so much pressure that she hadn't been able to have a baby. But then once she had my mom to love, it released all the pressure, and that's how come she was able to conceive. And I kind of bought it. I liked it. That's a cute story, right? And basically what my grandma was doing was focusing in on, she adopted, and then she was able to conceive. And so she kind of presented adoption as like a fertility treatment. And in fact, she would look around for other people who had adopted their first child and then conceived later. And she'd say, see, it works. She literally would say, see, it works. She also looked at her friends who never adopted and never had their own child and looked at it like, well, you should have adopted a child, because then, you would have had a child to love, your child would have had a happy home, and maybe you would have had a baby after that. So she always looked at it like her friends and the people that she knew who never adopted really, missed, multiple opportunities with that. She was like, see, they never had kids. It just shows you they needed to have adopted. She was focusing on just the information that confirmed her belief. And she ignored the vast majority of people in the world who did not adopt and yet were able to have their own children. That's, 85% of the population. And she also ignored those people who adopted children and still were never able to conceive their own children. She ignored that. She focused in just on the confirming evidence and ignored the disconfirming evidence. It's a really common thinking error that we all display when we are trying to, in hindsight, which we talked about in an earlier segment, explain something that we've observed. We try and make it make sense. And this is the theory that she came up with. And she might have heard it from someone else, because I understand it's a pretty common theory. She came to the conclusion that adoption is a fertility treatment. I kind of bought this story, by the way, until I had my first child. And then I was I had to say to my grandma, how could you even possibly have claimed that my mom was a fertility treatment? This kid is birth control. Whoever has time for sex after this, Grandma? What are you talking about? Of course, I'd like to remind you, my uncle was born 4 years later, and I was still in the midst of this little baby infant when I said this. My second child was born when my first one was 3, so I really ultimately understood, but it was kind of like at the moment, I was like, this is not relaxing, Grandma. What are you talking about? But let's go ahead and stop there. That's my little spiel on correlations. Let's come back and talk about our final method, which is how we finally are going to find out about causation, and that's through doing an experiment. Okay.